I trusted my daughter-in-law more than I trusted the doctors. And yet that night, in that freezing hotel room, I turned on the camera and saw her standing beside my wife's bed, not with worry on her face, but with a calm that was terrifying. She didn't call a nurse. She didn't check the machines. She simply leaned down, blocked the lens, and did something a so-called devoted daughter-in-law should never do. In that moment, I understood a painful paradox. The person who took care of my wife the most was also the one making sure she would never wake up. Before I go on, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit subscribe to follow real family stories like this one. Now, let me take you back to the moment when everything first began to crack. I left the farm that morning with a heaviness I couldn't quite name. Winter in Tennessee isn't especially harsh, but my house had been cold from the inside. Not from the wind, but from the silence that had stretched on for 2 years, since the day Martha was laid down in that bed. Isabella walked me all the way to the car. She wore a cream-colored sweater, her hair neatly tied back. Her voice was soft, just gentle enough to make anyone believe she was the perfect daughter-in-law. She reminded me to bring a warm coat. She told me not to worry, that everything at home is taken care of. I nodded. I didn't doubt her. At least, I thought I didn't. 3 days away. An education conference I had agreed to months earlier. A way of convincing myself that my life still had chapters that weren't fully closed. Before leaving, I stood for a long time outside my wife's bedroom. The breathing machine hummed steadily. The monitor still made its familiar sounds. Isabella stood beside me, adjusting the blanket, wiping Martha's hands with movements so practiced they put me at ease. But that sense of ease didn't last. I realized something was wrong. Not that night, but weeks before. Martha wasn't improving. That alone wasn't unusual. The doctors had been clear that recovery, if it came at all, would be slow. But some things didn't fit any medical explanation. Small bruises began to appear on her arms, faint, but regular. When I asked, Isabella said it was from changing IV lines. She said older skin bruises easily. Julian stood nearby, nodded along, and told me not to wear myself out worrying. Every time I mentioned bringing in another doctor, or moving Martha to a specialized recovery center, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Isabella was always the first to speak. Very calm, very reasonable. She talked about costs, about the risks of moving her. She said Martha needed stability, not experiments. Julian cut in more bluntly. He said it would only prolong the pain, and that money was running thin. I listened. I acknowledged what they said. But I was no longer at peace. Some nights after everyone had gone to bed, I stood in the hallway and looked at the door to my wife's room, left slightly open. I heard footsteps, very soft ones, not rushed, not hurried, as if the person walking knew exactly what they were doing and wasn't afraid of being caught. When I stepped closer, the sound disappeared. Isabella always said it was just her checking the equipment. She said she didn't want to wake me or make me worry. That's when I began to understand something simple and painful. Care that looks too perfect can also be a sign. Before the trip, I did something I never thought I would do. In my old study, where my father's antique clock still hung on the wall, I removed the back panel. I asked an acquaintance to install a small camera inside it, just enough to capture the entire bed where Martha lay. No loud sounds, no indicator lights, just a silent eye, watching the place where I had put all my trust. I didn't tell anyone, not because I was certain something was wrong, but because I wasn't ready to face the possibility that I had been wrong about my own son and daughter-in-law. On the first night at the hotel, I didn't turn on the camera right away. I sat for a long time by the window, looking down at the fog-covered parking lot. I wondered if age had made me suspicious, if years of fear and loss had finally twisted my judgment. I blamed myself for not protecting my wife better. And then, because of those very thoughts, I opened the app. What I saw didn't resemble any form of care I had known. Isabella entered the room without the familiar tray of supplies. No bright lights, no whispered reassurances. She closed the door quietly, like a habit she had repeated many times before. Her face under the dim light no longer carried its usual softness. It was empty, calm, almost cold. I turned off the screen, not because I couldn't bear it, but because I needed time to understand what I had just seen truly meant. I sat there, hands resting on my knees, back straight, the way I used to stand at the lectern. One thought kept repeating in my mind. If I was wrong, I would apologize. But if I was right, then my family had been breaking from the inside for a very long time, and that was only the first night I wasn't home. I didn't sleep that night, not because what I saw was too shocking, but because it was terrifyingly ordinary. There was no rush, no sign of hiding. Isabella moved through that room like someone who was used to never being questioned. Close to midnight, I turned the camera back on. This time I forced myself to watch until the end. Isabella stood beside Martha's bed. The night lamp cast a soft yellow glow, dim enough to blur the edges, but clear enough for me to see every movement. She didn't check the monitor. She didn't adjust the blanket. Instead, she placed a small bag on the table and opened it very slowly, as if she was more afraid of disturbing the air than the person lying there. I saw the vials. No hospital labels. No familiar control seals. She took out a syringe, her hand steady, not a trace of hesitation. When the needle touched the IV bag, my chest tightened, not because I knew exactly what she was doing, but because I understood something far simpler. This was not a random act. Isabella leaned closer. Very close. Close enough that I saw her lips move. I couldn't hear a sound, but I could read them. Words not meant for anyone else to hear. No tenderness. No pleading. Just quiet confirmations. As if she were speaking to herself more than to Martha. My hand clenched so hard my nails pressed into my skin. In that moment I still hoped I was wrong, that this was some procedure I didn't understand. That medicine had methods beyond the knowledge of a retired old professor. Then Isabella pulled out a thin stack of papers from her bag. She placed them on Martha's chest, aligning them carefully. I recognized them immediately. Legal documents, the kind I had signed hundreds of times in my life. Transfers, authorizations, papers that only matter when the signer is fully conscious. She took Martha's hand. Not the kind of hold meant to comfort, but the kind meant to control. I saw Martha's fingers remain still. No resistance, no cooperation. Isabella leaned even lower. Her face had changed completely now. No trace of devotion. Only the cold patience of someone waiting for a door to open on its own. I turned my face away. Not out of fear, but because I needed to breathe. When I looked back at the screen, the papers were gone. Isabella cleaned up neatly. Before leaving the room, she stood still for a moment, staring at Martha for a long time. No emotion, just an evaluating look, like someone studying a locked door without the key. I sat there until morning. I didn't call anyone. I didn't shout. I've lived long enough to know that the first reaction is rarely the right one. The next morning I called home. Isabella answered. Her voice was the same as always. Gentle, caring. She said Martha was stable. She said the night had been quiet. I asked very little. I didn't want her to suspect anything. I only said I would be coming back later than planned because an unexpected meeting had come up. On the second night I turned on the camera earlier. Isabella entered the room again. This time there was no hesitation. Everything moved faster, more decisive. Then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. She knew exactly when I usually checked the camera. She avoided looking directly at the antique clock, but she always positioned herself in the deepest blind spot. As she was about to leave, the door opened. Julian walked in. For a brief moment I still held on to a fragile hope that my son didn't know, that he would ask questions, that he would stop it, but Julian did nothing. He just stood there, looked at his wife, then glanced toward the bed. I saw his lips move. A short question, practical, empty of a son's emotion. Isabella nodded. Julian spoke again. This time I read it clearly. He mentioned the lawyer. He mentioned timing. He said that if this condition continued, everything would be easier to handle. I understood then. Neither of them wanted Martha to pass on. At least, not quickly. What they needed was prolonged silence. A body still alive, but without a voice. An existence legal enough to lock every door of objection. I watched Julian open the bookshelf in my study. He searched through it calmly. No rush. He knew exactly where I kept my papers. Isabella stood guard at the door. They moved together with small, familiar gestures. So practiced that I knew this was not a plan formed overnight. I turned off the camera, not because I had seen enough evidence, but because I had realized something even harder to accept. If I went back right now, I would be the final obstacle, and obstacles are always removed in the quietest way possible. I sat in that hotel room so still I could hear the wall clock ticking each second. There was no longer a question of, is it happening? Only when. And I knew that if I didn't act in time, that silence would last forever. I didn't leave that chair until the sun was fully up. When the first light slipped through the hotel curtains, I finally stood, washed my face with cold water, and looked straight into the mirror. The man staring back at me looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were different. They no longer hesitated. I understood then that what I had witnessed wasn't a moment of poor judgment. It was a system, carefully built. Isabella had the knowledge. Julian had the motive, and they both had time. The only thing they were missing was one final obstacle: me. I didn't go home. That was my first decision, and the most important one. Going back now would expose my suspicion, and once suspicion is detected, silence turns into tighter locks. I called Julian first. I let my voice sound tired, deliberately slow. I told him my car had trouble on the way back, that I'd have to stay one more night. Julian was quiet for a few seconds. That pause told me more than any answer. Then he said not to worry, that everything at home was the same as always. The same as always. A phrase far too neat for something running this smoothly. Right after that call, I contacted an old friend, not because of blind trust, but because he's the kind of man who doesn't ask unnecessary questions. We'd worked together years ago, back when I was teaching, and he was in civil investigations. I didn't give details. I only said I needed to verify something inside my own home, quietly. He understood immediately. That afternoon I received another call, this time from Isabella. She asked if I was all right. Her voice was still gentle, still proper, but beneath it I heard that familiar sense of control. I kept my answers short. I said I was tired. I said I might be back later than planned. I knew that with every hour I delayed, their confidence would grow, and confidence makes people careless. On the third night, I didn't turn on the camera right away. I waited. I let them believe I had relaxed my guard. When I finally checked, just as I expected, everything moved faster. Isabella didn't hide as carefully. Julian appeared earlier. They interacted more. Not with words, but with nods, glances, small signals that made it clear they were moving in the same direction. I recorded everything. Not to satisfy my anger, but to build a safe way out for Martha. What chilled me most wasn't what they did. It was how they spoke about the future. Julian stood by the window, looking out over my farm, as if it already belonged to him. He talked about selling the land, about dividing assets, about investments that needed to be liquidated quickly. Martha in those conversations was reduced to a condition that needed to remain unchanged. I turned off the camera when they left the room. I knew I was running out of time. Once the documents were found, once guardianship was activated, everything would become far more complicated. And I also knew that a direct confrontation wouldn't just be against two people, but against a story they had already prepared, one that favored them. I called a doctor I had worked with years ago on a medical education research project, not to ask for a diagnosis, but to ask one simple question. If someone shows signs of recovery, but is being kept in an unresponsive state, can that be detected? He didn't answer right away, but his tone grew serious. And I knew then that I hadn't been wrong. As night fell, I realized I was standing at a crossroads with no room for error. One path led to safety through silence, for me alone. The other led to an exposure that could completely destroy my family in the truest sense of the word. I chose the second path, not out of anger, but because I've lived long enough to know this. Some things, if not spoken at the right time, will be sealed forever. And silence in this case was no longer patience. It was complicity. I began to prepare, not rushed, not reckless. I let them continue to believe I was far away, still tired, still trusting, while quietly each piece of the truth was placed exactly where it belonged. And I knew, the next night that door would no longer stay closed. I didn't sleep that night either. But this time, it wasn't from panic. I lay still on the hotel bed, both hands resting on my chest, listening to my own breathing to keep my mind steady. From this point on, every decision had to be exact. No room for sudden emotion. No room for mistakes. Early in the morning, I left the hotel and drove to a small town not far away. I chose a quiet coffee shop and sat in a corner where no one paid attention. There I made the first call in a chain of actions I had weighed carefully all night. My old friend answered right away. I spoke slowly, clearly. I didn't tell the story with emotion. I gave him timelines, actions, and what I had documented. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked only one question. "Where do you want this to end?" I looked out the window, catching my faint reflection in the glass. "I want to get my wife out of that room," I said, "and I want everything to be seen exactly as it is." He told me not to go home yet, told me to keep playing the role of the tired, trusting father. In the meantime, he would do his work, quietly. I agreed. Waiting was something I had learned to do well. The second call was to the doctor I had contacted earlier. I didn't ask for details. I only said I needed a medical team ready to move at night. No sirens, no flashing lights, just ready when called. He was silent for a few seconds, then agreed. Not out of curiosity, but because he heard the urgency in my voice. That afternoon I called Julian. I said the car was fixed, but I still didn't feel well. I asked to stay one more night to rest. He sounded appropriately concerned. Too appropriate. He told me not to rush, said everything at home was still fine. That was the second time in 2 days I'd heard those words. And this time they didn't reassure me at all. That evening, I turned on the camera earlier than usual. I didn't stare. I watched like someone who had already accepted the truth and was only waiting for the moment. Isabella entered the room. She did what she always did, quicker, now more efficient. Julian appeared shortly after. They spoke very little. I could tell they were trying to keep everything contained, as if they knew time was no longer on their side. Close to midnight, my phone vibrated softly. A short message from my old friend. "Tonight works." I didn't reply right away. I waited. I wanted everything to align. When Isabella leaned down beside Martha's bed once more, I sent back a single word. "Now." I stood up, put on my coat, and left the hotel. The drive home felt longer than I remembered. The entire way I didn't think about Isabella. I didn't think about Julian. I thought about Martha. About the mornings we stood on the porch, drinking coffee in silence. About how she always knew what I was worrying about, even when I never said it out loud. When I arrived, the house was still dark. No signs of anything unusual. I parked at a distance, just as planned. My old friend was already there, standing behind the trees. The medical team waited in an unmarked vehicle. I entered through the side door. No one heard a thing. I had lived in that house for over 3 decades. I knew exactly which floorboards made noise, and which didn't. I walked straight into the living room. The television screen lit up. The feed from the camera inside the antique clock filled the screen. Isabella stood beside Martha's bed. Julian was behind her. Both of them froze when they noticed the light. I stepped out of the shadows and stood in the middle of the room. No one spoke for the first few seconds. I didn't shout. I didn't ask questions. I just looked at them. Isabella's expression changed quickly, from surprise to calculation. Julian stood frozen. He looked at me like he was seeing something that wasn't supposed to exist. I gave a signal. The back door opened. My old friend entered with 2 others. The medical team followed, moving straight to Martha's room. No hesitation. No glances. Isabella took a step back. Julian opened his mouth but couldn't finish a sentence. I raised my hand for silence. "Everything that has happened," I said, my voice low and even, "has been documented." I didn't need to say more. Behind me, the screen continued to replay what I had watched over many nights. No explanations needed. No interpretation required. Isabella looked at the screen, then at me. She didn't try to hide anymore. Julian lowered his head. For the first time, I saw my son shrink inside the house he had grown up in. The medical team signaled they were ready. Martha was moved out carefully, quietly. I walked alongside them, holding her cold hand. I didn't speak. I just stayed there. When the vehicle door closed, I turned back toward the house. I knew that from that moment on there was no going back. But I also knew the door of silence had been opened at the right time. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt like I was no longer standing outside the life of my own family. When the doors of the medical vehicle closed, I stood still in the yard for a long time. Not because I wasn't ready to go back inside, but because I needed to be sure I was standing on the right side of the decision I had just made. The night wind moved through the bare trees, cold but clean, For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe all the way in. The days that followed moved slowly under a new kind of order. I stayed with Martha at the care facility, where daylight wasn't blocked by heavy curtains, and the smell of disinfectant no longer filled me with fear. The doctors worked carefully, quietly, step by step. They made no promises. They only said that when the suppressing factors are removed, the human body sometimes finds a way to speak for itself. I believed them. At home, things unfolded the way they needed to. No noise, no spectacle. What needed review was reviewed. What needed clarification was clarified. I didn't retell the story with heavy words. I let the truth present itself, through images and timelines. I spent my life teaching. I know the weight of evidence when it's placed where it belongs. Julian didn't come to see me. I didn't look for him either. Some distances don't need to be closed right away. As for Isabella, she no longer existed in my daily life. Everything related to her followed its own path without me standing over it. I chose to focus on the only thing still worth holding on to, Martha's recovery. Then one morning, as I sat by her bed reading short passages from a book she used to love, I felt her fingers close around mine, very lightly, almost like a reflex. I stopped. I didn't call anyone. I just said her name, once. Then again, Martha opened her eyes. Not in the miraculous way people like to tell stories. No sudden tears, no immediate words, just a slow, searching look, until it settled on me, as if she needed to be sure she was in the right place. I held her hand tighter. I didn't say much. I had waited too long for that moment to waste it on words. The days after were made of small steps, but steady ones. Martha practiced speaking again, one word at a time. She relearned light, sound. Some days she was tired. Some days she stayed quiet for a long while. I stayed with her. I didn't rush her. We had learned that everything needs its own time. When Martha was clear enough to understand, I told her what had happened. No exaggeration, no softening. She listened, her eyes calmer than I expected. When I finished, she nodded slightly. I felt something was wrong, she said, her voice still weak. But I couldn't speak. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. I returned to the farm one pale afternoon. The house was the same, but it no longer felt heavy. I opened every window. I let light flood the rooms that had been kept in shadow. I cleaned my study, reorganized the papers. Some things I kept, some things I closed forever. I made a decision I had prepared for a long time. All financial ties connected to Julian were ended within proper legal boundaries, not as punishment, but as a necessary line. If family is to continue, it must be built on respect, not dependence. Julian sent me a short message. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain himself either. He only said he understood my decision. I read it, then set the phone down. Some relationships need to be left alone so each person can carry responsibility for their own life. Martha and I slowly returned to our old routines. Morning coffee on the porch. Slow walks along the path behind the house. We spoke less than before, but every word was clearer. No assumptions, no long, loaded silences. One morning as the sun rose over the trees, Martha placed her hand on mine. "You did the right thing," she said. I didn't answer right away. I looked out over the field as the mist lifted. "I only did what needed to be done," I said. "I'm not telling this story to seek sympathy. I'm telling it because some truths need to be spoken in the calmest voice possible. Sometimes danger doesn't come from loud hostility, but from care that looks too perfect. Sometimes protecting your family doesn't mean keeping everything intact, but having the courage to open doors that have been closed for far too long. When night falls, I turn off the lights and stand on the porch for a while. Martha sleeps peacefully inside. The farm returns to its familiar rhythm. I know that life won't be easier from here on, but it will be more honest. And for me, that's enough. If you've listened all the way to the end, thank you for staying with my story. If it made you pause and think, please hit. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And subscribe so you don't miss other stories. Quiet ones, but truthful. The message I want to leave you with is simple. Sometimes the most dangerous things don't come from open hostility, but from false care and prolonged silence. Listen to your instincts. Notice the smallest changes, and don't be afraid to set boundaries, even with family. Family isn't where we close our eyes and trust blindly. It's where we treat each other with respect and responsibility. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the clarity to protect what truly matters in your life.